There is something about the wilderness that strips away every pretense we carry with us into the ordinary world. Out there, under open skies or beneath a thick canopy of ancient trees, life gets very simple, very fast. You eat, you sleep, you move, and you listen. You listen to the wind shifting through the branches. You listen to the snap of a twig somewhere in the dark. You listen to your own heartbeat when it suddenly decides to pound a little harder than you expected. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, what you hear out there changes you in ways you don't fully understand until years later, when you're lying awake at 3 in the morning and that memory creeps back in like smoke under a closed door. The stories we are going to sit with tonight are not the kind that come wrapped in neat, reassuring endings. They are the kind that real people carry quietly inside themselves, usually for years, sometimes for decades, before they finally find the courage or the words to put them into sentences. They are stories of strange encounters, terrifying nights, impossible choices, and moments where life, ordinary, fragile, human life, came to a very sharp and frightening edge. Some of these voices belong to seasoned campers and hikers, people who were confident and capable and still found themselves completely unprepared for what crossed their path. One voice belongs to a young woman who, at one of the lowest and most vulnerable points of her entire life, was forced to fight like her very survival depended on it, because it did. And one story belongs to a man who spent several long days walking through a wilderness with someone he never fully understood, and who still, to this very day, cannot say for certain whether he was the lucky one or whether he made a terrible mistake he will never get to correct. These stories are real. These are things that genuinely happened to genuinely ordinary people who simply stepped outside the boundaries of the familiar and found something waiting for them there in the dark. If this is your first time joining us, welcome. Pull up somewhere comfortable, because once we get started, you are going to want to stay until the very end. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a story. We have new narrations coming your way regularly, and there is always something waiting just around the corner. And for those of you who have been here before, I am so glad you came back. Now, let us begin. Story 1, The Johnson Family. Our first storyteller is a man who, by his own honest admission, was not exactly at his finest moment in life when this particular series of events unfolded. He was not a bad person, not really. But he was drifting, coasting along on someone else's generosity, and the woman who had been carrying the weight of that arrangement finally reached her limit. Her name, for the purpose of this story, was Erin. And she told him it was over, packed up his things, and sent him out the door. Now, most people in that situation might head to a friend's couch or a cheap motel. This man, however, went camping. He and Erin had built a real tradition around camping. She had grown up with it. It was something her family had done since she was small, and she had brought it into their relationship early on. He had been skeptical at first, more comfortable with the noise and energy of parties and spring break-type vacations, but the moment she convinced him to try it, he was completely hooked. There was something about it that scratched a very particular itch, the freedom of the outdoors during the day, the looseness of evenings around a fire, and the satisfying feeling of having genuinely done something with his body and his time. He had loved it deeply. And so he dragged himself and his wounded pride out to the campsite that he and Erin had visited together regularly over the years. A place they both knew well. Not completely remote, not overly commercial either, the kind of spot where individual campers and small groups scattered across the area, where park rangers made occasional rounds but never hovered. A real campsite. A lived-in, comfortable, familiar place. He told himself he was going there to commiserate. To grieve the relationship quietly and alone, the way a man who fancies himself self-sufficient tends to imagine he will handle heartbreak. And he told himself something else, too, something he only admitted later, and only barely, that there was a faint, stubborn little hope sitting in the back of his heart that Erin might show up. That she would come to this place that meant something to both of them, alone or with her family, and that something meaningful might happen between them. A conversation. A reconciliation. Some version of the ending he actually wanted. That did not happen. Obviously. What did happen was that he woke up on the second morning of his solo trip, head foggy from the previous night's drinking, and found a car parked near his tent. A family was unpacking. Right there. Right next to him. In all the time he had spent at this particular campsite, he had never once seen anyone set up camp in that exact spot. And honestly, it was not hard to understand why. The ground there was not ideal for camping. It was not the most level patch of earth, not the most sheltered, not the most appealing. And yet here was this family, cheerfully unloading their vehicle and staking their claim directly beside him. He sat in his folding chair, nursing his hangover and a plate of sausages, and he stared at them. Not politely, not discreetly, openly, with the full weight of his bad mood bearing down on them. He wanted to make his presence felt. He wanted them to be uncomfortable enough to go somewhere else, anywhere else, because he had come here to be alone with his misery, and this was simply not what he had planned. He pieced together their name from fragments of overheard conversation. He calls them the Johnsons here, though that wasn't their real name, something similar, something that stuck in his memory mainly because of how many times the father said it. The father, it turned out, was very fond of invoking the family name as a unit of behavioral measurement. The Johnsons do not act like this. The Johnsons help one another. The Johnsons do not behave like little brats. This was said in a high-pitched, slightly nasal voice that carried with remarkable clarity across the campsite and directly into our narrator's pounding skull like a particularly determined woodpecker. The irony was that the two kids, a boy and a girl, somewhere in the range of 8 to 10 years old, appeared to hear absolutely nothing their father said. They treated his voice like background noise. An occasional glance in his direction when he really escalated his volume, maybe even a giggle, and then straight back to tearing around the campsite, yelling things at each other that our storyteller quite pointedly declines to repeat in polite company. And the worse their language got toward each other, the more the father's pitch climbed. The mother of this household, meanwhile, had set herself up in a portable sun lounger, the one item she had apparently removed from the car herself, and watched the entire chaos unfold with the serene detachment of someone who had long since made her peace with the situation. At some point during the afternoon, when the heat really settled in and our narrator was sitting there watching this disaster of a family vacation from behind the cover of his book, the mother began sunbathing without her top on. He noticed. The father noticed that he noticed. And the atmosphere, already charged, tightened another notch. He knew he should probably turn his chair around. He knew that. He was also in a genuinely bad mood, had been drinking, and was in no frame of mind to be reasonable. He was here first. He was not moving. The evening brought clouds that cooled the temperature and ended the sunbathing. The family lit their campfire, the one feature of that particular location he had always appreciated, and the children resumed their dangerous game of orbiting the flames far too closely while their father's threats escalated from verbal warnings into something considerably more alarming. At one point, the dad grabbed his son's arm and yanked it hard enough that our narrator fully expected the boy to cry, to flinch, to show some sign of being hurt. Instead, the kid just leveled a word at his father that would make most adults stop cold, and then ran off after his sister like nothing had happened at all. Our narrator sat there in his chair, beer in hand, scowling at the whole terrible tableau and feeling, despite everything, a complicated kind of relief. He had come here thinking the universe was rubbing his face in what he had lost. What he might have had with Aaron if he had been better, more stable, more present. But looking at this family, this loud, angry, miserable family with their dysfunction on full and very public display, he started to feel differently. Not smug, exactly. Just, less sorry for himself. He also knew, in the small honest corner of his brain, that he was enjoying the father's escalating agitation a little too much. That he was deliberately not doing anything to diffuse the man's fury, even quietly enjoying his role in it. He had worked his way back around to the kind of drunk where picking a fight seems perfectly reasonable, and he was sitting there like a lit match next to a gas can, hoping for something to happen. And then the evening ended, and nothing happened. The wind kicked up. The cold got into his bones. He retreated to his tent. Now, If you are finding this story relatable at all, maybe you've had a neighbor or a campsite companion who drove you absolutely up the wall, go ahead and drop a comment below. We would love to hear about it. And if someone in your life needs a good story to listen to tonight, share this video with them. It only gets more intense from here. He read by flashlight for a while, listening to the ongoing soundtrack of screaming children and screaming father filtering through the tent walls. And eventually, blessedly, things went quiet. He drifted off. He woke up needing to use the bathroom. Badly. He crawled out, made his way into the tree line, handled his business, and noticed that the Johnson family's tent was fully dark and silent. No sign of trouble. He went back to his own tent, pulled his sleeping bag tight against the cold that had moved in sharply while he slept, and tried to settle back down. And then the screaming started again. But this was not the same kind of screaming. This was not kids trading insults or a father losing his temper over table manners. This was different in its texture, in its urgency. The mother and the daughter both, voices overlapping in a way that had nothing to do with the petty chaos of the afternoon. And through that tangle of noise, he made out a sentence, one sentence, that went through him like a blade of ice. What did you do to him? He lay there, completely still. The bravado he had been carrying all day had evaporated. His mouth had gone dry. He tried to gather himself, tried to think about getting up and going over there to check if someone needed help. And then he heard a crack. Something hitting something, or someone. And more screaming followed. He reached for his phone. He still had cell reception, barely, and he called emergency services. The dispatcher who took his call transferred him to a local officer who told him, with the kind of patience that barely concealed its own frustration, that the campsite was outside local police jurisdiction and that for non-emergency issues, he should contact the park ranger. He tried to explain that this did not feel like a non-emergency. He tried to explain what he had heard and what it had suggested to him. But his words were slurred, and his delivery was not convincing, and he got the impression that the officer on the other end of the line was filing his concerns somewhere between drunk camper and unreliable witness. He was still trying to find the park ranger's number on his phone, 4G out there was painfully slow, when the screaming next door picked back up. This time there was a male voice tangled in with it. He could not tell whether it was the son or the father. The father's voice was high-pitched enough at the best of times that the two were difficult to separate. But the content of what was being screamed, the things they were saying to each other, the accusations, the urgency, made him increasingly, sickeningly certain that something very serious had happened inside that tent. He could not prove it. He would never be able to prove it. But listening from inside his own tent, trying to breathe quietly and dial a number with hands that had started to shake, he became almost certain that one member of that family had done something catastrophic to another. And then the screaming dropped away. And through the wall of his tent, he saw the glow of something orange. Not the campfire. The campfire was in a designated pit and had been dying down for hours. This was something else. Something burning that should not have been burning. That was his limit. He had reached the point where he could not stay put any longer. He told himself he was going to unzip that tent and go over there and make himself useful, whatever that meant. He reached for the zipper. He was going slowly. Stalling, maybe. His fingers found the zipper tab and he started pulling it open, and that is when the headlights of the Johnson family's four-wheel drive snapped on. The engine roared. And the vehicle was pointed directly at him. There was no thinking involved in what happened next. It was pure, animal survival. He ripped the tent open and threw himself sideways as the vehicle accelerated and came tearing across the campsite, directly over his tent, over everything he had brought with him, his gear, his food, his belongings, crushing it all under the wheels as it went. And then it was gone. Taillights disappearing into the darkness. Gone. He lay on the cold ground and breathed. He called 911 again. This time, with a vehicle that had just tried to run him over, they took him seriously. Police arrived. And while he waited, he did something that genuinely surprised him. He found the smoldering remnants of what had been the Johnson family's tent, and he put the fire out. Water bottles. Dirt. Whatever he had left. It wasn't large, but it was real. And as he worked to smother the last of it, he thought he saw something in the wreckage. Something that might have been a shape that should not have been there. He cannot say for certain what it was. He does not say it definitively. But he cannot unsee it either. The police took his statement. They told him they would follow up. They did not. He has no idea, to this day, what happened to any member of that family. He does not know if anyone in that vehicle was hurt. He does not know if anyone was left behind at that campsite. He knows only that someone in that vehicle made the decision to drive toward him, whether intentionally or in panic, and that he moved just in time. He credits one thing with saving him: the driver had switched the headlights to a low beam setting. Not off, which would have left him hearing the engine but seeing nothing. Not full beam, which would have blinded him completely. Low beam, which gave him just enough warning, just enough light, just enough time. He still thinks about all the variations. What if the lights had been different? What if he had been slower? What if he had been standing a foot to the left? He is still in therapy over it. And when he sits down to think about that night, it is always that moment, those headlights swinging toward him in the dark, that his mind returns to first. He says he is not ashamed of that. And he shouldn't be. Story 2, The Man in the Woods. Our second story comes from a hiker who was heading solo into the Adirondacks. He knew the area reasonably well, had explored it on a few separate occasions, though not for a couple of years before this particular trip. He was 2 days into what he expected to be a 3-day journey to reach his usual camping spot when he started noticing the trees. They were full of holes. His first instinct was the obvious one: hunters had been using them for target practice. Lazy, careless, but not impossible. The area wasn't exactly designated hunting land, but that wouldn't have stopped a few local teenagers with nothing better to do from wandering out and firing into the trees for the fun of it. It was a reasonable explanation. Except when he stopped and looked more carefully, the holes didn't look like bullet holes. There was no splintering of the wood, no jagged tears in the bark, no sign of the force that a projectile leaves behind. These holes were clean. Circular. Deliberate. They looked, for all the world, like they had been made by a drill. He had seen a documentary at some point about maple syrup production in Canada, the way farmers tap trees and coax that sweet sap out of them. Standing there in the quiet of the Adirondack forest, that is exactly what these holes reminded him of. But these were not maple trees. He was fairly sure of that, though he will readily admit he was not particularly expert on the subject of tree identification. And the sap that had leaked from many of these holes and dried against the bark did not look or smell like anything that would ever find its way into a bottle of syrup. The smell, actually, was one of the more memorable details. He struggled to describe it accurately. He got closest by comparing it to the smell of freshly cut grass that has been left in the summer heat a little too long, the kind of sweet gone sour scent that builds up in a lawn bag on a warm afternoon, and then imagine mixing into that the tang of wet bark, and maybe some kitchen compost, and something slightly sharper underneath all of it. Not pleasant. Not the kind of smell you would walk toward on purpose. He walked toward it anyway, because that is what curious hikers do. And the further he moved along his route toward his planned campsite, the more trees he encountered with those same holes. And the fresher the holes became. Some of them were still actively weeping sap, the liquid dark and strong-smelling and absolutely revolting when, against every sensible instinct, he put the tip of his finger against one and touched it to his tongue. It was every bit as awful as it looked. Whatever these trees were producing, nobody in their right mind was tapping them to eat it. Or so he assumed. He came around a tree, and there was the man. He was big. Tall and broad and covered in enough body hair that under different circumstances, in a different setting, the word Sasquatch would have come to mind and maybe not immediately seemed like an exaggeration. He was holding a hand drill, the old kind, operated by turning a handle, and he was using it on a tree trunk with the practiced ease of someone who had done this many times before. He had not noticed the hiker yet. And what he was doing after he drilled, that is the part that lodged itself permanently in our narrator's memory. He was pressing his mouth to the hole he had just made and drinking the sap directly from the tree. Drinking it, and then throwing his head back and making a wet, satisfied, lip-smacking sound that carried through the silence of the forest with horrible clarity. Our narrator crouched behind a tree trunk and watched in complete disbelief. The man was wearing clothes. He was using a manufactured drill. By every technical measure. He was a human being engaged in a human activity. But what he was doing felt so far outside the range of anything recognizable that the brain simply did not know what category to file it in. The decision to sneak away felt like the only reasonable one available. He tried. He genuinely tried to be quiet. He moved slowly, placed each step with care, held his breath. And then his foot came down on a stick, and the crack it made in that dense, silent forest was loud enough that he felt it in his chest. The man's head snapped around. For one terrible second their eyes met. And then the man was moving, charging through the trees directly at him, full speed, the drill still gripped in one hand, waving it over his head as he ran. Our narrator ran. He is not ashamed to say it. He ran as fast as he possibly could. The man behind him was massive, but mass is not always an advantage in a forest chase, and our narrator was young and fit and absolutely motivated. After what felt like a very long time, long enough for his heartbeat to become the loudest sound he could hear, he was confident he had lost his pursuer. He had veered off his original route, and the trees around him were ordinary, undrilled, without holes. He was in territory that felt safely unfamiliar to the man who had been chasing him. He pushed himself the rest of the way back to his car. He took short naps in roadside ditches rather than stopping to set up his tent, not wanting to lose any time or create any target. The experience left him shaken in a way he didn't fully shake off for quite a while. He found more drilled trees as he got closer to civilization. His heart rate spiked again at each one. But the man did not reappear. He reached his car, got in, and drove away. He has not returned to that area since. He considers this a perfectly reasonable decision. He still doesn't know what that man was doing. He doesn't know if there is a rational explanation, something mundane and harmless, or whether what he witnessed was the tip of something far stranger. He just knows what he saw. And he knows how fast he ran. Story 3, The Dining Table at the End of the World. If you have spent any real time on hiking trails across the United States, and especially if you have ever wandered the length or breadth of the Appalachian Trail, you already know that the woods have a way of offering up things that have absolutely no business being there. Discarded objects. Forgotten things. Remnants of human presence in places where human presence feels deeply improbable. Our next storyteller has accumulated quite a catalogue of such sightings over the years. Strange things seen alone and with groups. Things that stuck in the memory long after the trip was over. But none of them, he says, none of them came close to the dining room furniture. Let that sink in for a moment. Not a piece of clothing snagged on a branch. Not a rusted tin can from another era. A dining set. A full table and 6 chairs, arranged in the middle of the wilderness, far from any trail, far from any location that would have made the slightest bit of practical sense as a resting place. And when he says middle of nowhere, he is being precise about it. This was not somewhere you could reach by carrying furniture from a nearby road for 20 minutes. Getting that table and those chairs to this location would have required a group of people, carrying heavy wooden furniture, for what he estimated was likely several days. The logistics of it were baffling. The sheer effort involved was staggering. Somebody had wanted those chairs in that clearing badly enough to make it happen, and the only explanation he could imagine, that it had been placed there intentionally, set up like a bizarre picnic site, made the whole thing stranger rather than less so. The chairs were positioned around the table as though someone had just stepped away from dinner. The wood was waterlogged and rotting. Insects worked their way through every joint and surface. Moss and overgrowth had begun their slow reclamation of the whole arrangement. It was deeply, thoroughly wrong in every way, and he loved it immediately. He was, by his own description, a lover of the creepy and the unusual. Finding this bizarre piece of domesticity dropped into the middle of wild nature hit all the right notes for him. He photographed it, spent a while looking at it, and then moved on to scout a camping spot. There was a clearing a few hundred yards away that looked perfect, and he set up for the night there. After eating, he settled into his tent. He was not tired in the restless, anxious way, he was pleasantly unwound, taking in the sounds of the forest the way you do when you have truly learned to enjoy solitude. The creak of branches. The distant call of something in the dark. The comfortable white noise of nature doing what nature does. This was his favorite part of any camping trip. The listening. Until the footsteps began. Not close, maybe a few hundred yards in the direction he had come from. Multiple sets of footsteps, moving through undergrowth, making no particular effort to be quiet. He lay still and listened as the footsteps slowed, and then stopped, and were replaced by the low sound of voices. He unzipped his tent just enough to look out. He pulled out his single monocular, a compact little tool he carried for wildlife watching, and pointed it in the direction of the sounds. There was a faint light over there. And in that light, seated around a rotting dining table in the absolute middle of the wilderness, were 4 men. 3 of them were younger. The 4th was older, and even from that distance, in that dim light, he could make out the detail of an eye patch. The night was quiet enough that he could catch fragments of what they were saying. Cards were involved, they appeared to be playing some kind of game. And they were talking about kills. About hunting. About taking deer from private land nearby, which made them almost certainly poachers. He processed that information and started to exhale. And then one of them said something about what they were going to do with the other body. He stopped breathing entirely. He listened for a long time after that, crouched just inside the opening of his tent with cold air pooling around his ankles, trying to convince himself that he was misunderstanding. That they were talking about a second deer carcass, or a dead animal they needed to dispose of, or anything other than what the conversation increasingly seemed to be about. But the more he heard, the harder that reassurance was to maintain. They were talking about a person. A man. Someone they described as a family member. Someone they described, with a certain calm that was more chilling than any display of emotion would have been, as someone who had it coming. They were discussing where to put the body. He was approximately a few hundred yards from 4 men who had quite possibly killed a person, sitting openly in the dark, talking about it. And they had no idea he was there. He ran through his options with the quiet, controlled desperation of someone who knows that panic is a luxury they cannot afford right now. He could stay in the tent and be as still and dark as possible, hoping they never wandered his way. He could try to crawl away to a more hidden position. Running was out, he could not outrun men who knew this land and almost certainly had firearms, and the noise of running would give him away immediately. He chose to move. Quietly, carefully, army crawling across the cold ground on his elbows and knees until he reached an overhang ditch he had noticed earlier in the day. He pulled himself into it, raked some loose grass and brush over himself as best he could, and went very, very still. They found his tent. He heard them moving through the clearing, heard the murmur of their voices as they went to look. He pressed himself deeper into the ditch and did not breathe. After what felt like a very long time, he heard them conclude that whoever had set up this camp was gone, probably moved on, abandoned the site, not worth worrying about. And he lay in that ditch and did not move even after the sounds of them had faded, because the kind of caution that comes from hearing men talk about hiding a body is not easily switched off. He lay there for hours. He wet himself twice. He will tell you so directly and without embarrassment, because there is no response to that situation more honest than a terrified, involuntary human body being exactly what it is. When the forest had been absolutely silent for long enough that his bones were aching and the cold had worked its way into every muscle, he crawled out of his hiding place, gathered himself, and moved as quickly and quietly as he could back toward the trail and eventually to his car. He called the police as soon as he had enough reception to do so. He went into the local station when they asked him to. The officers there listened to his account with an expression that he describes as more frustrated than sympathetic. They took his details and told him they would reach out if they needed anything further. They never did. He has spent the years since that night quietly, almost obsessively, monitoring the local news from that area of Appalachia. Looking for any report of a body found. Of an unidentified victim. Of something that might confirm or at least connect to what he heard that night. And here is the part of this story that sits heaviest on the chest. He never found nothing. What he found, every single time he looked, was the quiet, terrible reminder that bodies are found in those woods with a regularity that most people who have never been to truly remote wilderness would find deeply unsettling. Unidentified remains. Unexplained disappearances. Cases that opened and did not close. He cannot know if any of those cases connect to what he heard that night. He never will. He knows what he heard. He knows where he hid. And he knows, and means this as a genuine piece of advice, offered with the full weight of personal experience behind it, that if you are going to spend time in places like that, you should not go alone. It is dangerous to go alone, friends. Camp in groups. Look out for one another. And if you ever find a rotting dining table in the absolute middle of the wilderness, do yourself a favor and keep walking. Now, if this story is raising questions for you, if you've seen something out there that you couldn't explain, leave it in the comments below. You are not alone. And whatever you experienced, we want to hear about it. Story 4, The Woman Under the Overpass. Before we go any further, our next storyteller wants to make one thing completely clear, and she says it herself, right at the beginning: she is safe. She is warm. She is well. She has a long-term partner now, a home, a life she built from the ground up after a period of time that was, by any honest measure, genuinely terrible. She was homeless. Not unhoused, she uses the word she chooses, without apology. She was a young woman without a home, without a community, without a single reliable safe place to sleep at night. And she was living rough, outdoors, either in a sleeping bag or, for a while, in a small pop-up tent until that tent was destroyed. She is in her early 20s. She is writing to share what happened on the last night she spent with that tent. She didn't know it was going to be the last night, of course. She was simply exhausted, truly bone-tired, the kind of tired that builds up over days of walking and nights of interrupted, weary sleep. She was also, she will admit plainly, floating on something she won't name. When you are living rough, she explains, you take whatever relief you can find. She always tried to keep it controlled, just enough to take the edge off the constant, grinding anxiety of her situation, not enough to lose herself. She had a small amount of food. She had found a spot under a remote-feeling overpass, somewhere that felt isolated enough to be relatively safe, at least for one night. The weather had been mild, though it was fall and the forecast was turning. She was not looking forward to another winter on the streets. She read some old magazines, a 3-day-old newspaper she had been keeping for the warmth it offered in her sleeping situation. For the first time in days, she felt the knot in her chest loosen slightly. She let her guard down. She let herself sleep. She woke up to a sound. It was a kind of bark, sharp and abrupt, coming from outside the tent. Then it came again, and she recognized it, a laugh. A single raspy laugh. Old, she could tell. And the sound of lungs that had seen decades of smoke rattling behind it as it came a third time. She had to make a decision, and fast. She could stay hidden and silent and hope this person moved on. She could make herself known, announce her presence, let it be clear she was not easy prey. She waited for a fraction of a second. She did not get the chance to decide. A massive weight came crashing down onto the tent from above. The entire structure collapsed inward, and she was underneath it, pinned by something enormous and sudden, like a person had dropped themselves onto her from a height. She thinks that is exactly what happened, that this man, whoever he was, had found her tent and simply launched himself down onto it. The move had something almost theatrical about it, grotesque and deliberate. And then, through the collapsed walls, a hand. A heavy, thick-fingered hand. Holding a box cutter. The blade was slashing through the tent fabric, wildly, looking for her. She kicked out as hard and fast as she could, caught him somewhere that made him recoil, and in the confusion the box cutter dropped. She grabbed it first. She cut through the back wall of the tent, enough to drag herself out, and pulled herself to her feet on the cold ground beneath the overpass. And there he was. She describes him as a huge monster of a man. Old. Filthy in the way that comes from weeks or months without access to running water, layered in the kind of grime that settles into skin and clothing over time. He stank. And he was laughing, that same single rasping laugh, even now, even as he struggled to get his bearings after her kick, as if he found the whole situation deeply funny in some private and disturbing way. There was a single light under the overpass, flickering but functional, and it gave her enough to see by. His face was badly scarred. His nose had the collapsed, eroded look of someone whose body had been catastrophically damaged by long-term substance use. He had a cleft lip. And his eyes, small and very pale and very awake, found her in the dim light and registered what they saw. A young woman. Small. Alone. She watched the calculation happen in real time across his face. She had the knife. Which gave him pause. He had the physical advantage of sheer size, which she could see him weighing. She held herself steady, ready, watching him as he watched her. And then he charged anyway. He hit her full force, all of his weight behind it, and drove her to the ground. The knife flew from her hand. He was on top of her, pinning her with his stomach, his hands moving, and she felt the specific, unmistakable terror of knowing exactly what this man intended to do. She did not freeze. She could not afford to freeze. She started hitting. Fists against the side of his head, as hard and as fast as she could throw them, over and over. His head was sensitive, she could tell almost immediately because the first hit made him flinch, and the second drew blood that dripped down onto her face, warm and immediate, and he howled, but he kept laughing too, that awful single laugh, like whatever substance was in his system had put him somewhere the pain could only partially reach. He rolled off of her. She scrambled to her feet. He was on his back, rocking, unable to right himself quickly, and she made the calculation she needed to make, she could not run without her bag. Everything she owned in the world was in that tent. Everything. She could not leave it. She crossed the ground, reached into the collapsed tent, pulled out her tote bag, and a hand locked around her ankle. She hit the ground hard. Her wrist took the impact in a way that she would later find out constituted a real sprain. She would also later reflect that a sprained wrist, given everything, was genuinely miraculous. The man was pulling her toward him, muttering something urgent and incomprehensible. She doesn't think it was English, doesn't know what language it might have been, cannot rule out that it was simply nothing coherent at all. One of his eyes was leaking something yellow. His mouth was bleeding from where her fists had opened his skin. She swung her bag hard, into the side of his head. He went back. She stomped down with everything she had left. And then she ran. She ran until there was light. Until there were people. Until the overpass was far enough behind her that the drumming of her heartbeat started, slowly, to return to something approaching normal. This, she says, was the wake-up call she had been building toward for a long time. She cannot go into all the details of how she turned things around because that is a longer and less frightening story for another time. What matters is that she did. Step by step, she rebuilt. And she never spent another night in a pop-up tent. She never went to the police. She explains this matter-of-factly, without defensiveness. It simply was not a realistic option for someone in her situation at the time. She has thought about the man occasionally since then. She thinks, given how he looked that night, that there is a reasonable chance he did not survive much longer. She finds she cannot muster much sympathy for that possibility. She hopes, if he is still out there, that he is somewhere he cannot hurt anyone. She has nightmares still. When they are at their worst, his face is there. Scarred, laughing, watching her from the dark. She is safe now. She wants you to know that. And she wants you to know, whoever you are, whatever situation you might find yourself in, that surviving something does not make you less than. It makes you someone who survived. Story 5, The Business Suit Man. Our final storyteller has been sharing this story for years. He tells it to friends, he turns it over in his own mind, and every single time he revisits it, he finds something new, some detail he had filed away unconsciously, some red flag he walked past without recognizing in the moment. It is the kind of story that gets stranger the longer you look at it. He was in his early 20s. He had, by his own admission, a very particular self-image at that point in his life, stoic, capable, rugged, a little bit pretentious in the way that young men sometimes are when they've read a lot of survivalist books and watched a lot of wilderness programs and decided they are considerably more prepared than most people around them. He was tall, broad, physically capable, and he spent a significant amount of time camping alone in remote areas, often deep wilderness. He does acknowledge the obvious. Camping alone deep in the wilderness is genuinely not a great idea. If something goes wrong, there is nobody there. If you need help, you will most likely not get it in time. He has said as much to people who asked, and he means it sincerely. And yet he also says, honestly, without contradiction, that those solo camping years were some of the best of his life. The feeling of being entirely responsible for your own survival, of having only your own judgment to rely on, of the stakes being real and immediate, there was nothing like it, and he does not regret a moment. He was 4 days into a planned 8-day hike when the man walked into his clearing. He was in the middle of setting up his tent in a spot he had chosen carefully, and the appearance of another human being was so unexpected, so completely outside what the previous 4 days had prepared him for, that his first reaction was pure defensive wariness. He straightened up and watched the man approach without speaking. And then he took in the man's appearance, and his wariness shifted into something more like bewilderment. The man was wearing a business suit. A casual, office-appropriate, professionally tailored business suit. No hiking gear. No pack. No indication of having prepared for a moment of outdoor activity, let alone days of it. He looked like someone had simply picked him up from a downtown office building and dropped him into the middle of the forest, and he was not quite sure how it had happened. But looking more carefully, and our narrator looked very carefully, he could see that the suit was disheveled. The man was not crisp and composed, he was disoriented and quietly frightened, though he was trying to hold himself together. His eyes had a quality that disturbed our narrator in a way he could not immediately name. There was something glassy about them, something not quite focused on the present moment, that reminded him of a great-grandmother who had suffered from dementia. The first thing the business suit man said was to ask where they were. Our narrator told him. Gruffly, carefully, still not yet sure what he was dealing with. The man looked puzzled, as though he suspected he was being lied to. It took several more exchanges before they reached something like a functional conversation, and what came out of that conversation was this: the man had no memory of how he had come to be standing in the middle of the wilderness. The last thing he could remember was leaving work. That had been approximately 4 days ago. There are very few explanations for that kind of gap. Our narrator ran through them: a severe drinking binge, some kind of blackout episode, or, more seriously, head trauma or a significant neurological episode. He asked, as gently as he could, whether the man could remember any injury, any impact, anything that might explain a days-long memory gap. The man seemed genuinely unable to access anything at all. And here is the thing that really drove the strangeness home: they were not somewhere you could stumble into. This was not a park with trails an hour from a parking lot. This was deep wilderness. Getting to where they were standing required either deliberate planning and multiple days of hiking, or something that made far less sense. When our narrator spread out his map and they went over it together, the picture was not encouraging. By his best calculation, they were approximately 3 days from where he had left his vehicle, in one direction, and approximately the same distance to the nearest town in the other. He mentioned the town's name almost as an afterthought, and the business suit man's face changed. He lived there, he said. He had a girlfriend. He worked in the city during the week. Despite every sensible reason not to, and there were several, our narrator invited the man to camp with him that night, so they could both get some rest and a warm meal before beginning the long hike back to civilization the next day. He acknowledges freely, young and arrogant and not thinking clearly about what it meant to invite a stranger to be present while he slept. He knows that now. He knew it somewhat in the abstract even then. He simply chose not to let himself dwell on it. He woke up the following morning intact. The business suit man was still there, deeply asleep, crammed into the space beside him, snoring with real commitment. Our narrator slipped out, cleaned up, assessed their provisions and their route, and felt something close to his usual self-assurance returning. He had enough supplies for what he estimated was approximately a year, he jokes. He was confident they could make it. He was less confident about the man's mental state, which did not appear to have improved overnight. The man drifted in and out of conversations without warning. His memory of the missing days remained completely inaccessible. And occasionally, when our narrator caught the man looking at him, there was something in the expression that he found difficult to describe, a quality to the gaze that did not quite fit the surrounding situation. He remembers thinking, even then, that it was an odd look. He chose not to examine it too carefully. They set out that morning, our narrator having loaned the man some spare hiking gear so he at least had appropriate footwear and layering. The man, once he was no longer wearing a suit, almost looked like someone who belonged out there. And he hiked with a competence that surprised our narrator, kept pace. Navigated rough terrain without stumbling, handled himself in a way that felt a little too practiced for someone allegedly unprepared. The conversation as they walked covered some peculiar ground. The business suit man kept returning to questions of morality. What did our narrator believe happened after death? Did he think there was something beyond this life? What were his views on the soul, on existence, on what made a person's life mean something? Our narrator, by his own description, was exactly pretentious enough at that age to engage with these questions seriously, which he did, even as some part of him registered that this was a strange conversation to be having with a stranger in the middle of nowhere. The second day, what our narrator calls, with a grim kind of humor, Predator Day, started with the business suit man grabbing his arm and telling him they were being followed. He dismissed this. He had trained himself to detect surveillance, he said, with the supreme confidence of a 20-something who had done a lot of camping. The man gave him a look that he now reads as knowing, and said something he chose not to finish. Our narrator pushed on. An hour later, the man grabbed his arm again. He was more insistent this time. He thought maybe a bear, he said. Maybe a mountain lion. Our narrator pointed out that neither of those animals were particularly likely in this specific area. The man jeered at this response in a way that implied he knew something our narrator did not. And then the business suit man stopped walking, turned toward the trees, and started yelling at whatever he thought was following them, telling it to show itself. Shouting that they had a gun and were not afraid to use it. Our narrator did, in fact, have a gun. A small pistol, for emergencies. He had told the business suit man nothing about it. The shouting rattled him more than he wanted to admit. Not because he believed they were being followed, he did not, or at least he did not want to, but because that level of certainty, that specific and unwavering conviction that something was out there, had a way of working on the nerves regardless of what logic said. Every ordinary sound became something else. Every movement in the underbrush became a question mark. He kept hiking. He pushed them hard that second day. Later than was wise. Into the dark, navigating by flashlight, insisting it was fine, partly because he needed to keep moving and partly because he did not want to stop while the business suit man was still muttering about being watched. By the time they made camp, our narrator believes they were perhaps half a day from his car. By his calculations, which he now suspects were significantly off. They set up the pop-out tent and heated rations on the camp stove, no campfires in unapproved areas, he was at least principled about that, and sat in the low warmth of it while he tried once more to help the man piece together any fragment of memory from the missing days. He got nothing useful. The stories the man offered about his job and his life were vivid enough but had a quality to them, our narrator says, that felt slightly fictional, as if they had been assembled from things read or watched rather than lived. He couldn't prove any of it was false. He just couldn't shake the feeling. That night, they were on the edge of going to sleep when the flashlights swept across the clearing. Men came in fast. Multiple of them. One immediately spoke directly to our narrator, calm and firm, telling him to stay still, that everything was all right, that he was safe. Others moved directly to the business suit man and, before our narrator had fully registered what was happening, had him in handcuffs and were moving him away through the trees. They seemed like federal law enforcement, unmarked jackets, badges, a quality of authority that was hard to fake. The badge that was shown to our narrator was difficult to read in the dark, but years later, having thought about it many times, he believes it was FBI. They operated efficiently, quietly, with the kind of practiced precision that suggested this was not their first time doing this particular thing. The business suit man was taken away. Our narrator watched him go. He says he thinks he remembers the man smiling as they led him off into the trees. He cannot be certain that detail isn't something his imagination added later. He wants to be honest about that. The agents told him he was safe. They told him he had avoided a terrible fate. And then they left. He stood alone in the dark clearing with 100 questions and no one to ask them to. The next morning, making his way to the car, which he discovered was a much shorter distance than he had estimated, only about half an hour from where they had camped, he checked his pack carefully. The hidden compartment where he kept his small pistol was empty. The business suit man had found it, without being told it existed. Without any indication he had been shown where it was. He had searched the pack thoroughly enough to locate a weapon in a concealed pocket. He had taken it. The small amount of cash from the same compartment was also gone. And when he reached the car, one of the tires had been slashed. One, not all, cleanly, deliberately. As if it were intended not to stop him completely but to slow him down. To create a delay. To buy time for something. Some of his friends believe he spent those nights in the wilderness with a serial killer, a man who had been operating in that region, targeting specific victims, for years before that trip. That would explain the predatory quality of the glances, the questions about death and mortality, the way he kept pace with a supposedly unprepared man through some of the hardest terrain their route covered. It would explain why, if our narrator was not the intended type of victim, the man may have been biding his time or re-evaluating. It would not explain who the men with badges were. Or whether they were really who they appeared to be. And that is the question that sits with our narrator the most uncomfortably. He would like to believe he was rescued. That the agents who appeared in his clearing that night were legitimate, that they were there because they had been searching for this man, and that they arrived just in time. But he cannot stop the other possibility from surfacing now and then. The possibility that the business suit man, whatever else he might have been, was someone vulnerable, someone lost or ill or in genuine need, and that our narrator, by camping with him and guiding him toward what he thought was civilization, had inadvertently delivered him to people who meant him harm. He does not know which possibility is true. He may never know. He says, with a kind of weariness that carries real weight, that he has learned to hope for the version of the story that makes him the lucky one. Because the alternative, that he handed a person in need over to the wrong people, is something he finds genuinely unlivable to sit with. He still hopes, even now, that he made the right call. He hopes that the business suit man, whoever he was exactly who the worst version of the story says he was. Because then at least nobody got hurt who didn't have it coming. He just doesn't know for sure. And maybe, he says quietly, maybe that's better. Friends, we have sat with some heavy things tonight. Stories from ordinary people who stepped outside the edges of the familiar and found the world a great deal stranger and more frightening than they expected. Stories about bad luck and bad choices and moments of pure, absolute terror that changed the way these people understood themselves. What strikes me most, every time I read through accounts like these, is not the fear, it is the resilience. The woman who fought back with her bare hands and rebuilt her life from nothing. The man who ran and made it to his car. The hiker who lay in a ditch for hours and refused to give up. The young man who guided a stranger through the wilderness and is still working through what that meant. These people are still here. Still telling their stories. And there is something quietly extraordinary about that. If any of tonight's stories touched something in you, if you've had an experience in the wilderness or anywhere else that you've never quite been able to shake, we would genuinely love to hear about it in the comments. Your story matters. And you might be exactly what someone else needs to hear tonight. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and share it with someone who appreciates a good, true, spine-tingling story. It makes a real difference and helps us reach the people who are sitting somewhere right now, looking for exactly this. And if you are not already subscribed, now is the perfect time to join us. Hit that bell so you are notified whenever a new video goes up. There are always more stories waiting, and you do not want to miss what comes next. What do you think about the business suit man? Do you believe he was dangerous? Do you think the agents who showed up were legitimate? Leave your thoughts below. I read every comment, and this is one I genuinely want to hear your take on. Until next time, friends. Stay safe. Stay together. And take care of one another out there.